December 15, 1821. Cape Mesurado, West Africa. A.U. Izet. Navy lieutenant named Robert Stockton aimed a pistol at the head of a local king. The transaction took 4 minutes. The price, $300 in rum, tobacco, muskets, and cloth. The land a strip 36 miles long and 3 miles wide. The justification, freedom. But this was not liberation. It was expulsion disguised as humanitarianism. The colony's name would be Liberia, from the Latin word for free. Yet the United States would refuse to recognize this free land as a sovereign nation for 41 years. Why? Because recognizing Liberia meant recognizing a black republic. And Southern congressmen would never accept a black ambassador in Washington. This is the story of America's only African colony, the one it pretended didn't exist. By 1816, the United States faced a demographic crisis that terrified both sides of the slavery debate. Free black Americans numbered 60, 0 inches, 1,790. By 1820, they numbered 233, 000. These weren't enslaved people who could be controlled. They were free citizens who lived in a nation that had no intention of treating them as equals. For slaveholders in Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, free blacks represented an existential threat. Their very existence undermined the logic of permanent bondage. If some blacks could be free, educated, and prosperous, then slavery couldn't be justified as a natural condition. Worse, free blacks encouraged enslaved people to escape. They depressed the market value of slaves by proving that black labor didn't require chains. For abolitionists in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, the situation was equally intolerable. They believed slavery was morally repugnant, but even the most progressive whites couldn't imagine racial integration. They looked at free blacks and saw people who would never be accepted as equals in white society. The conclusion was shared by men who agreed on nothing else. Free blacks had to go somewhere. Not to Ohio or Indiana, those territories had already passed laws banning black migration. Not to Canada, too close. Too expensive. Too cold. The answer, they decided, was Africa. On December 21, 1816, a group of men gathered at the Davis Hotel in Washington. They founded the American Colonization Society. The vice presidents represented a perfect paradox. Henry Clay of Kentucky, a slaveholder who owned dozens of human beings. Robert Finley of New Jersey, a Presbyterian minister who preached abolition. Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote Land of the Free while owning 7 enslaved people. Bushrod Washington, nephew of George Washington and the organization's first president. Former President Thomas Jefferson endorsed the plan publicly. Sitting President James Madison arranged federal funding, $100, 0 inches, 1,819. Future President James Monroe would have an entire capital city named after him for his support. Even Abraham Lincoln, decades later, called colonization, appealing before admitting it was logistically impossible. The stated mission was humanitarian: rescue free blacks from American racism, give them a homeland where they could govern themselves, spread Christianity across Africa. But this was not mercy. It was strategic calculation to solve America's racial equation by subtraction. Southern states wanted to remove the threat that free blacks posed to slavery's stability. Northern states wanted to remove the embarrassment that racial inequality posed to Republican ideals. The ACS didn't hide this. In their own publications, they called free blacks useless and pernicious, a threat to security and culture. The society's genius was convincing both camps that colonization served their interests. Slaveholders saw it as preserving slavery. Abolitionists saw it as a path toward gradual emancipation. February 6, 1820. The ship Elizabeth Times departed New York Harbor. Passengers, 88 free black Americans and 3 white ACS agents. Destination, Sherbro Island, Sierra Leone. The journey took 1 month. The death toll began immediately. Malaria struck within weeks of arrival. All 3 white agents died by the end of the year. The survivors fled to the British colony of Freetown. The ACS didn't pause. They didn't investigate why their first attempt had killed so many people. They simply prepared a second expedition. In 1821, the ship Nautilus Times arrived with 33 more settlers and 2 new agents. Dr. Eli Ayres, a physician from New Jersey, Lieutenant Robert Stockton, U.S. Navy, the man who would found Liberia at gunpoint. Stockton's orders were explicit: acquire land for a permanent colony. The location, Cape Mesurado, 150 miles southeast of Freetown. The challenged local chiefs had no interest in selling their ancestral territory to foreigners. For days, negotiations stalled. King Peter of the Day People refused to meet again with the Americans. He accused them of being slavers, a reasonable suspicion given the cargo of freed slaves aboard their vessel. On December 15, 1821, Stockton made a decision. He and Ayres marched inland to King Peter's village. What happened next is disputed by historians, but multiple accounts converge on the same image. Stockton leveled a pistol at King Peter's head. He handed a second pistol to Ayres with instructions: shoot that villain if he opens his lips again. The villain Stockton referred to was a mixed-race trader, warning the king that the Americans intended to destroy the slave trade. The treaty was signed, the Ducour Contract, named after the local name for Cape Mesurado. Signatories included King Peter, King George, King Zoda, King Long Peter, King Governor, and Chief Jimmy. The land transferred Cape Mesurado and Dozoa Island. The payment: muskets, gunpowder, iron pots, tobacco, beads, shoes, coats, hats, pipes, canes, and rum. Total value approximately $300. Historians debate whether the gun was actually pointed or merely present as a deterrent. It doesn't matter. Coercion doesn't require a trigger pull, only the credible threat of one. The Americans renamed Dozoa Island Perseverance. In April 1822, the first settlers moved from Perseverance to the mainland. They began building what would become Monrovia, the capital of a nation that wasn't a colony, except it was. Between 1820 and 1843, the American Colonization Society transported 571 people to Liberia. By 1843, only 819 remained alive. Mortality rate, 60%. The primary killer, malaria. Specifically, Plasmodium falciparum, times the deadliest strain of the parasite. Endemic to West Africa. African Americans had no immunity. Their ancestors had been removed from Africa generations earlier. The genetic resistance that protected some West Africans had been diluted or lost. In the first year, 22% of arrivals died. The American Colonization Society knew these numbers. They published mortality reports. They received letters from Liberia describing the death toll. And they kept sending people. Why? Because admitting the mortality rate was unsustainable would mean ending the organization. The ACS managers had jobs to protect. State colonization societies had funding to justify. Church congregations had missionary ambitions to fulfill. The deaths were framed not as policy failure but as divine testing. Trials and tribulations that God provides as a means of testing the fortitude of man. This was not ignorance. It was calculated institutional preservation. Researchers would later determine that Liberian settlers experienced the highest mortality rates in accurately recorded human history. Higher than the Middle Passage. Higher than the trenches of World War I. Higher than any other documented human migration. The ACS framed it as sacrifice for a noble cause. It was demographic disposal with a Christian veneer. The original Cape Mesurado settlement was microscopic by colonial standards. 36 miles of coastline, 3 miles inland. Total area roughly 140 acres. But the American Colonization Society didn't stop there. Individual states created their own colonization societies and purchased adjacent territories. Mississippi in Africa, Kentucky in Africa, the Republic of Maryland at Cape Palmas. By 1838, these settlements merged into the Commonwealth of Liberia. The expansion was not peaceful. Indigenous peoples, the Kru, Grebo, Vai, Gola, Bassa fought back. In 1822, they launched a coordinated attack on the colony. The settlers survived only because King Sao Botswine of Bopulu arrived with a massive armed force. He threatened to behead any chief who interfered with the Americans. Why did he help the colonists trade access? The Americans controlled rum, firearms, and manufactured goods from the Atlantic. Sao Botswine wanted those supply lines secured. Geopolitics, not charity. The settlers built fortifications in 1824. They named the settlement Liberia. They named the capital Monrovia after President James Monroe, who had funneled federal money to the project. They imposed American legal structures on African territory. They refused to integrate with indigenous societies. They created a racial caste system with themselves at the top. The Americo-Liberians, 5% of the population, would dominate Liberia's government for the next 133 years. By the 1842, the American Colonization Society faced a crisis. Britain and France were expanding their West African empires. British merchants disputed Liberia's right to levy customs duties. French traders encroached on Liberian territory. The problem: Liberia had no sovereignty. It wasn't a U.S. colony. Congress had never chartered it. It wasn't an independent nation. No country recognized it as such. It was a private settlement controlled by a non-profit organization. European powers didn't recognize the ACS as a legitimate governing authority, which meant Liberia couldn't defend its borders, couldn't enforce trade laws, couldn't negotiate treaties. The solution: declare independence. On July 26, 1847, Liberia proclaimed itself a sovereign republic. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a mixed-race man born free in Virginia, became its first president. Britain recognized Liberia immediately and signed a treaty of commerce. France recognized it. Germany recognized it. The United States did not. From 1847 to 1862, the United States refused to acknowledge Liberia's independence. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate political calculation. The reason was stated explicitly in congressional records. Southern states would not accept a black ambassador in Washington. C. Recognizing Liberia meant exchanging diplomatic missions, which meant a black man with ambassadorial credentials could walk into the White House. He could attend state dinners. He could sit in Congress to negotiate treaties. For Southern politicians whose entire political economy rested on the premise of black inferiority, this was unthinkable. So Liberia existed in diplomatic limbo, a nation that Britain, France, and Germany acknowledged, but a nation its own creator refused to recognize. The absurdity was perfect. The United States had funded Liberia's creation. American ships had transported its settlers. American naval officers had acquired its land, possibly at gunpoint. American presidents had endorsed the project. But acknowledging Liberia as a sovereign state would undermine the racial hierarchy that justified slavery. So the U.S. said nothing. For 15 years, on September 23, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln officially recognized Liberia. The timing was not coincidental. 1 year into the Civil War, the Southern states had seceded. Their congressmen had left Washington. The political power that had blocked Liberia's recognition for 15 years had evaporated. Lincoln could finally acknowledge the nation without facing Southern opposition. But even then, recognition was half-hearted. Lincoln had never believed colonization would work at scale. In an 1854 speech, he called the idea logistically absurd. If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia. But a moment's reflection would convince me that if they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days. He was right. Between 1821 and 1867, only 16,000 African Americans emigrated to Liberia. During those same years, the black population in the United States increased by 500,000. Colonization could never solve America's racial crisis. It could only export a fraction of the problem and pretend the rest didn't exist. So was Liberia a colony? By traditional definitions, no. It had no charter, no allegiance to a sovereign state, no formal relationship with the United States government. The ACS was a private organization, not an instrument of state power like the British East India Company. But consider the evidence: land acquired through coercion by a U.S. military officer, funded by federal appropriations and state legislatures. Populated by forced migration, many settlers were emancipated on the condition they leave immediately. Governed under American legal frameworks. Protected by U.S. no Navy patrols until 1916. If this wasn't a colony, it was something functionally indistinguishable from one. The difference was branding. Calling it a refuge or settlement instead of a colony allowed the United States to avoid the appearance of African imperialism. While Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany carved up the continent in the scramble for Africa, the U.S. could claim moral distance. We don't colonize Africa. We rescue people and send them home. Except Liberia wasn't home. Most of the 16,000 settlers had never set foot in Africa. Their families had been in America for 4, 5, 6 generations. They were as foreign to Liberia as British colonists were to India. And like British colonists, they imposed their culture on indigenous populations. They practiced forced labor, documented by the League of Nations in 1930. They leased vast territories to American corporations like Firestone for rubber plantations. They suppressed indigenous governance structures. They created a system that scholars would later call settler colonialism. The only difference: the colonizers were black. Here's why the Liberia Project reveals American strategic thinking in the 19th century. 1. Domestic stability over foreign expansion. The U.S. had no interest in African territory for resource extraction. Cotton came from the South, sugar from the Caribbean. Rubber wouldn't become critical until the automobile age. What the U.S. wanted was to remove the internal threat that free blacks posed to the slave economy. Colonization was cheaper than integration and less disruptive than civil war. Or so they thought. 2. Plausible deniability over direct control. By routing the operation through a private organization, the federal government avoided formal responsibility. When mortality rates became scandalous, blame fell on the ACS, not on Washington. When settlers complained about lack of support, the government could shrug. We gave you funding. The society mismanaged it. 3. Racial hierarchy as foreign policy. The refusal to recognize Liberia until 1862 wasn't an accident. It was a signal to European powers that the U.S. didn't consider black-governed states legitimate, even when those states were American creations, even when they adopted American constitutions. The message: will help remove black people, but we won't elevate them. Liberia survived. It remained independent through the entire scramble for Africa, the only African state besides Ethiopia to avoid European colonization. But independence is a generous term. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company controlled 10% of Liberia's land by the 1922. The UN work used Liberian ports extensively during World War II. American corporate interests shaped Liberian economic policy for a century. The Americo-Liberian elite ruled until 1980, when Samuel Doe, an indigenous Liberian, led a military coup. That coup triggered decades of civil war. The war displaced millions, killed hundreds of thousands, destroyed the infrastructure that American investment had built. Today, Liberia's population is 5 million. Only 5% claim Americo-Liberian descent. The descendants of freed American slaves remain culturally distinct. They speak English. They practice Christianity. They live in neighborhoods that architecturally resemble the American South. And they remain, in many ways, foreign to the land their ancestors were sent to 200 years ago. So why did the United States colonize Africa, but pretend it didn't? Because colonization was never the goal. Expulsion was. Liberia wasn't built to extract rubber or gold or timber. It was built to extract free blacks from American society. The colony served as a pressure valve, a way to remove people who threatened both slavery and white racial identity. When the project failed to scale, the U.S. simply recognized the independent republic and moved on. No territorial claims, no formal empire, no acknowledgement that 16,000 people had been sent to a land where 60% of them died. This wasn't imperialism in the British sense. It was something colder, a demographic engineering project disguised as humanitarian rescue, a solution to America's race problem that involved removing the problem instead of solving it. And when forced to choose between recognizing Liberia's sovereignty and maintaining Southern political power, the United States chose the South for 15 years. Because in the calculus of American geopolitics in the 19th century, domestic racial hierarchy mattered more than the legitimacy of black republics, even the ones America itself had created.